All right, guys, thank you again for joining us in this series for the Brave Body podcast, where we're really focusing on eating disorders and disordered eating, especially throughout NEDA week. And this has just been an amazing journey for me personally to be learning. And so, as I'm learning, I hope you're learning, but it's always really cool to bring on people who are just having a heart for the situation, have the knowledge, have the professionalism. And so, today we have Linda, and I've been poring over what you do out in Colorado and just so excited to have this conversation because it's so needed, as are the others, and just creating this content around a really hard topic, a really layered topic. And your niche especially is with athletes. So this is going to be a really cool conversation for a lot of people to be listening into, like especially for me. But first and foremost, can you just give us a little bit about who you are and how you got into this field specifically?
Yeah. Well, I'm super grateful for you kind of asking me to come on and just creating this space. And yeah, my name's Linda Steinhardt. So I'm a registered dietitian. I'm a board certified sports dietitian, and I really focus my work on eating disorders within the athlete population. And it's funny, I actually originally majored in marketing and
Okay.
went back to school. I grew up playing sports, volleyball mostly my whole life, and kind of saw the need throughout my years playing sports of, disordered eating is really common. And so felt really good about kind of going back to school, and it felt really fulfilling to want to help that population have a good experience within sports. So went back to school, knowing I wanted to work with athletes with eating disorders, and then did a fellowship at UNC Chapel Hill shortly after I became a dietitian, kind of in their sports nutrition department. And I was really fortunate to work with my boss, Rachel Manner, who really prioritized intuitive eating, health at every size within the athlete population. And um, worked in private practice very briefly before I moved out here to Denver. And I've been working at a kind of an athlete specific treatment center for about 3 years now. It's called ED Care. And then my specific program that I work within here is called Athlete Edge. So working at a higher level of care with athletes struggling with eating disorders.
Wow. So that's quite the journey. What is something that you love about what you're doing now, especially in this space with athletes and eating disorders, which I
Yeah.
feel it could be heavy for you sometimes, like to see the challenges that they're facing, but what do you love about it?
Oh gosh, yeah, so many things. I think the word that comes to mind is like fulfilling,
Mm.
because I think eating disorders, disordered eating, diet culture in general, right, like takes things away from us at times, in terms of like people being able to have a brain space to think about their sport or to spend time with friends or to feel flexible around food. And so to see that shift in people, or to see the light bulbs, right, turn on of like, yeah, I don't have to follow that diet culture rule, or like, and that is taking away from like my values and things like that. I think those are the most fulfilling moments, and just really I just feel proud, right, of people
Yeah.
that take on this challenge of diet culture and build up resilience to it. I think it's really special.
Yeah. I'm sure that's really cool to be able to kind of be a bridge away from such detrimental habits into a place where they're healthy and they're there to compete and not worry about all this other stuff. But I feel like you get to see a lot of discouraging moments too, and just kind of from your viewpoint and your experience, are there
Yeah.
certain athletes? Is there like a perfect storm, I guess? Is there a certain athlete or sport that's more susceptible to eating disorders? And do you find certain sports maybe create more of a pathway to those things to occur? Because there's some amazing, I mean, I'll share your website that, the place where you work now. There's some amazing stats about this particular thing. So can you speak into that a little bit?
Yeah. I think, team cultures are a big thing that I think can influence things.
Hmm.
So any sport can be affected, right? Any athlete can be affected or impacted by eating disorders or disordered eating.
Sure.
Um, and yeah, research shows that, some kind of classes, if you will, of sports are more affected statistically. So things like endurance sports, things like weight class sports, things like aesthetic sports. And right, I've worked with athletes from, you name the sport, I've worked with an athlete that plays that sport probably. And so I think we have a job, right, as athlete providers, as parents, as coaches, as teammates, right, to kind of create a space where people feel supported to get their needs met and supported to eat enough and supported to eat what they want, right? You're right, like the stats are pretty astounding in terms of athletes. And the one that sticks out to me the most that I kind of always have in the back of my mind is up to 1 in 2 female athletes will have some form of disordered eating or eating disorder, and up to 1 in 5 males will have some form of eating disorder, disordered eating. And that's a really big number. And so I tell people too, like, whether you specialize in working with eating disorders or not, like you probably have athletes on your team or teammates or friends or, people that you interact with that have disordered eating or eating disorders. So it's really helpful to feel informed or like you can at least guide someone in the right direction.
hmm So yeah, I mean that kind of leads into the next thing. Like, I mean, I coached for 15 years and it was never something that really, I coached girls for 15 years. It never really came to the forefront of my mind.
Sure.
Um, which now I'm like, I can't believe it didn't, but it just wasn't something I was focused on. So, I know the college space sometimes has more provision for this, but like, coaches in general, like, what are some things that we could do better from your point of view? Like, what are some conversations we maybe could be having prior or within our team culture, even at the high school level, where we probably don't have a nutritionist coming in to talk with us? Like, what are some things that we could do to maybe not add to the problem, but
Yeah.
really help
Yeah.
facilitate better conversation?
Yeah, yeah, and it's so important too. Like it's not their fault, right? Because we all live in this like diet culture.
Hmm
And so, it's really, really easy, quite honestly, in our culture to internalize messages about, okay, we should eat this and not that, or that's quote unquote good and that's quote unquote bad, right?
Yeah.
And so I tell people it's helpful to kind of learn about diet culture, be aware, build up resilience to it and understand, right, that like we all live in it, right? And so it can become kind of second nature. And so sometimes, I'll be talking with friends and I'll hear a comment that I'm like, oof, that's diet culture, right? But it's so normalized.
hmm
And so I think first step is just like learning about, what is diet culture? And what I mean by that is, right, like when in conversation, people kind of elevate certain foods and demonize others, or when we hyper focus on people's body shape and size, or when we relate that to what someone's eating, right? Things like that. So awareness, right? And then, I tell people to like, especially coaches, parents, if there's one message that athletes take away from them, I would want it to be to get enough to eat. Hey, let's make sure we're getting enough. Did you bring snacks? Hey, did you get something between games? Things
mm
like that. Because I've had a lot of athletes, right, who remember kind of like specific comments from coaches or parents or teammates that make them question themselves. And I remind people too, like we weren't born thinking that certain foods were good or bad, right? We
hmm
were born with this like innate ability to choose what we want and tell when we're hungry and tell when we're satisfied or tell when something tastes really good and we want more even though we're full, right? And so somewhere along the way, sometimes that can get disconnected. And so I want people to encourage people to get enough to eat. We don't hear that message enough, I don't think.
I don't think ever. I mean,
Yeah.
really, like that's a
Yeah.
rare message.
Yeah.
Yeah, and especially in athletics, I feel like for the most part, especially once you get to the college level, you're dealing with high performing human beings.
Right.
Like they are achievers. They're, put it however you want. Is there more of an inclination to those who are trying to achieve high? And so what does that make it more complicated where it's like they're not necessarily even just trying to be super thin or fit into, so they're also basing this on their livelihood at some point. And do you like what does that look like for you? Like what storm
Totally.
is that?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. And I think like, with athletes where they're at a greater risk for eating disorders, disordered eating. And the way I think about that is, yes, they live in diet culture along with everyone else, but there's these additional, sometimes pressures, like you mentioned, or just additional considerations that they might be making, right? So if athletes are, competing for playing time, that can be really hard. If they're not getting the playing time they want, right? Uniforms can sometimes make people feel uncomfortable with their bodies, injuries, taking rest days, this kind of like compensatory nature that some athletes develop with, okay, if I exercise this amount, then I can eat this amount, but if I don't, then I
Mhm.
can't, right? And so there's all these, as you mentioned, kind of layers to it where there's these additional pressures or considerations or things to navigate. And right in our culture that often, okay, if I'm struggling with something or if I want to be better at my sport, it often feeds us this idea, okay, change how you eat or change how you exercise or change your body, right?
Yeah.
It's really understandable why athletes would go that direction. And then the other thing I think about is eating disorders, disordered eating, right? They're coping mechanisms and they serve a function for some reason, right? And they're a maladaptive coping mechanism, but they're a coping mechanism. And so if people are struggling with burnout, with injury, with relationships within the team, with coach, whatever it may be, right? It can be kind of an avenue that people go to for safety, for comfort, for reliability, for familiarity, right? And so it's really nuanced because there's never just one thing
Yeah.
that, quote unquote, causes an eating disorder. So my job, right, is to help athletes kind of like unentangle how, their eating patterns might be related to any number of things, body image, sports, trauma, right? Anything like that.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, those like additional factors I think really kind of layer on top and make athletes at a greater risk.
Yeah.
Um, and so it's our job to support them in kind of unlearning those things.
Yeah, and there's so much I feel to unlearn, especially by the time they get to college. They've lived a whole
Yeah.
life, a whole teenage life
Yeah.
in that comparison game to social media life. I mean, there's a lot for you, I think, probably to unpack. I know I listened to a couple of other podcasts that you were on, and I was very interested because I don't think we've talked a lot about it. It was just body composition. And
Yeah.
you touched on it a little bit with just like, different body types can look and work and feel different. And so, can you speak into that? Because I think it was very interesting. And I'm like, oh, like we don't talk about that either. Like, two girls can have that, very healthy bodies, but look very different and just not even understanding. I mean, and I'll share that from my point of view. And I've probably shared it before. It's like by the time I was in junior high, like I was playing soccer all the time and I was bit like my
Mhm.
quads, they were bigger. Like,
Mhm.
and I was
Mhm.
always self-conscious of my legs because they were so much bigger
Yeah.
than the other girls. And like, and not that it was anybody's fault, but that got into my head where it's like I'm
Totally.
I'm a bigger girl, like, and I'm growing
Mhm.
faster, not realizing that it was just muscle from the sport I was playing. So,
Totally.
and it's so funny, like having these conversations, and I can go back and be like, wow, like I didn't have always the healthy body image that maybe I thought I did, and that was a very insecure point for me. So,
Yeah.
could you talk a little bit about body composition and what
Yeah.
that filters into with all of this?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And one of the things I think about too is this idea of what you were speaking to, like athlete body image versus like outside of athlete world
Yeah.
body image, right? And so it's called contextual body image. So sometimes people can feel really comfortable in their bodies when they're in their sport, when they're in practice, because they feel strong and powerful and they're performing well, perhaps. And then outside of sport, right? Muscularity, right? They might not feel as comfortable when they're going to class
Hmm.
or vice versa, right? They might feel comfortable, but they don't want to be muscular, right? So there can be some kind of like internal conflict about their body just based on the setting that they're in, which can create some kind of like internal battle of like, oof, what do I do with that? Body composition is really interesting. So I actually did research in grad school on athletes' perceptions of experience with body composition testing. And, another thing that can be pretty normalized within the sports world, especially at colleges and things like that. And it actually came from when I was a fellow doing a fellowship at UNC Chapel Hill. My boss and I were like, gosh, we've heard so many athletes say, I feel bad about my body composition when I get my results, or, oh, my fat percentage went up and now I need to, do something about my eating, quote unquote. And
Wow.
so I was like, I'm in grad school. I'll do research on that. And so it was really kind of astounding to me. I think I anticipated what the results might be, but um, what I learned was, athletes struggle with a hyper focus on body shape and size. And so, one of the questions I asked was, do you change the way you eat before when you know you're going to get body composition tested soon? And gosh, I'm not going to remember the stats off the top of my head, but it was over 50% of them do. Um, and most of those responses, I asked a follow-up question of like, if you change how you eat, like, what do you do? And a big, big majority of those people said, I eat less, I restrict.
Hmm.
Right. And so, I asked another question about, do you compare your numbers when you get your numbers to teammates? And again, large majority said yes. And so the way I think about that, right, is as a provider, like what are we using that information for? Because, if it's not helpful for recommendations, then it's is meaningless, right? And so me as a provider, I don't feel like I would get any meaningful information out of a body composition number because research shows that there's no like one body composition that people need to be at to perform well.
Yeah.
It's so individual for everyone. And so if we try to say, okay, this athlete is this percent body fat or this percent muscle, we need to change that somehow. That's not based on science, right?
Yeah.
That's based on bias and weight stigma, perhaps. The other thing I think about is if people are focused on body composition, right? Even if people are like, I have a goal of gaining muscle. Let's take that example. If people are eating enough, if people are timing their nutrition well, right? Like eating around workouts, eating consistently throughout the day, training appropriately, right? Training in a way that would help them build muscle, but also resting enough, right? They're going to build muscle, right?
Yeah.
And so I don't feel like I need as a provider, right, a body composition test to confirm that. I can ask them questions that are much less, that have much less risk, right? I think about that a lot. Body composition testing has risks in terms of a hyper focus on body shape and size, as the research showed, right? Like risk of comparison, risk of restriction, risk of, all of these things. And so I'm looking for low risk and high reward options, and body composition testing isn't to me necessarily one of those.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you find that that might phase out a little bit with more knowledge that we're getting, or do you feel like that's a pretty strong tool still used, especially at the
Yeah,
college level?
it's an interesting question. So when I was at UNC, my boss actually phased it out. And I think, there's some nuance there too, because we had really supportive coaches.
Mhm.
And so we could kind of like have those conversations and over time phase it out. And I think it's a really normalized thing again, like I said, where, people might say, oh, we need that information. And so I think again, like it's education, it's what do we actually use that for? Is it benefiting the athletes? Those sorts of things.
Mhm.
And my whole kind of spiel at the end of my paper that I wrote for grad school is like, if someone is going to do it, right, there needs to be informed consent. We have to inform athletes of risks of, hey, like this can be hard information to hear, or, we need to check up on them after they receive that information. We need to ask them if they want that information or
Yeah.
if they want to get tested, their body composition tested. And then we need to inform them of things like error rates, right? Because body composition testing has quite large error rates.
Okay.
Depending on the machine and also depending on the things like hydration, things like if someone just exercised can all affect the error rate. And so
Hmm.
I don't think that's kind of known enough either to athletes, right? When they receive their results and they think they went up X percent body fat, that could be within the margin of error, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think more awareness and then also, yeah, looking at the risks, benefits.
Wow. Yeah. That's a I had no idea that was that large. I was listening to you and and I started digging. I'm like, oh wow, this was much more prevalent than I thought. And I think sometimes even outside of that, I know I look at, like you said, aesthetic sports. So by that you mean I'm guessing dancing, swimming, maybe where our
Yeah,
bodies are exposed a little bit more.
gymnastics.
Um, yeah, I think that that's so relevant. And I just in these conversations, I look at like, you know, can we identify, and I know this is like a moving target for you, for everybody, is like, are there some things as a coach, parent, where it's like, I'm gonna, it's not, it's a red flag, maybe it's a yellow flag. But what are some, maybe if they all come together, like if there's more than like one or two of these flags, what are some things that we could probably have a trained eye to watch out for,
Yeah.
either in our own children or in our teams, where you're like, that could be concerning. I'm gonna watch this a little bit more.
Yep. Yep, a variety of things. So one thing that I think about is if people are avoiding like team meals. So let's say the team goes out to dinner, and you notice one of your athletes or your own child's kind of saying, "Oh no, I'm not going to go." And that's kind of a repeated thing, right? Isolation in general, like eating disorders, really like secrecy, and they oftentimes avoid situations with food, right? Things like a shift in the way someone eats, or comments like, "Oh, I shouldn't eat that," or I can't have that. Or I feel bad that I just ate that. Um, those sorts of comments. If you notice their eating patterns change, right? If they're not eating snacks at practice anymore, or if they're all of a sudden throwing away food that they normally don't throw away, or not, not finishing their plate if they usually finish their, whatever the case
Yeah.
may be. Also, if they share things like, "I just feel tired or sore all the time," right? Some soreness is sometimes very, very normal and very appropriate. If people start to notice, "I just always feel tired, my legs feel like bricks," right? Those sorts of comments, uh, that can be a sign of underfueling too.
Mhm.
Another thing that can happen is like loss of motivation for sports, for school. So if you notice just like affect changes, or if someone's more kind of like irritable, right? We need food to make neurotransmitters for our mood. We need food to make neurotransmitters to help us sleep, right? All of those things. So mood shifts, right? Of course, that can be for a million reasons, but something to just have on your radar too. Um, Weight changes, of course, if you notice kind of someone's weight change, or for an adolescent, right? If they drop off their growth curve. So if you go to the doctor and they're usually on X percentile and they're now, lower, much lower than that.
Mhm.
I think that's a big one just to be aware of at the yearly checkup.
Yeah.
Things like that.
Yeah, those are so good. Do you find that there's a propensity to overexercise during some of these? Like, is that one too? I've heard, I mean, this, I'm just asking you because I've heard, I want to hear from you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Certainly. If you notice them going to the gym more, exercising outside of like structured practices,
Hmm.
some people will notice, doing exercises at home, or saying, "Oh, I got to do an extra workout or run," or things like that.
Yeah.
Certainly. Certainly. Yeah. And one thing I should mention too, there's no shortage of workout videos, right, online or on social media, right? Social media is another big one.
Mm.
And so, if you notice people kind of gravitating towards those more, exercising in their room, right? And then the other thing is just, and every parent has a different thought on this, or way of communication to their kid around this, but social media can be a very big influencer for disordered eating and eating disorders.
Sure.
There's unfortunately like a lot of misinformation, or eat like this, not that, or eat like this and look like this kind of messaging on
Hmm.
social media. And the algorithm can get really strong, right? And so
Yeah.
the more that someone looks at that stuff, the more that that becomes their reality on social media. And
Yeah.
so I often, right, will help someone kind of like unfollow people. I'll ask them, "Hey, did you feel worse or better after you got off social media?" Or yeah, off social media.
Yeah.
And if they feel worse, right, we might unfollow people, and I might give them people, "Hey, go look at these profiles and see if you think they feel helpful," of like anti-diet sports dietitians or anti-diet messages.
Hmm.
Because I think in today's world, like that can be a really big influence too.
Yeah, that's so good. It's almost like instead of taking away social media altogether, is rebuild the algorithm because you
Yeah,
can.
yeah,
And
yeah,
that's so wise is to go in because there's a lot out there. I mean, I'm not even searching for it half the time, and it comes just knowing a female. I think they're just like, oh, here, you want to look like this at your age, or you want to do this,
yeah,
and it's very tempting. And I
yeah.
can't imagine the amount of messaging now,
Mhm.
compared to even when I was, a college athlete and stuff. It's got to be
Yeah.
so much that
Yeah,
you're
and that
trying to
was,
undo.
yes, and I think that's the big piece of like, I as a provider, right, and us as coaches or parents or teammates, I'm not necessarily going to change the whole culture that we live in.
Right.
Right? I wish I could. I certainly wish I could, but I'm probably not going to be able to do that
Yeah. Yeah.
on a national scale, right? And so what I try to do is help people build up resilience when they see those messages, and they can see them and say, "Oof, that kind of is uncomfortable to hear. That's making my brain go to, I need to do this, but I know that I don't need to do that," right? The
Yeah.
example that I often give for people is, sometimes I hear people, this is right, another potential form of diet culture kind of is calories on a menu, right? Like that didn't used to be a thing. But for some people, it's really, really hard to see. And so what I often tell people is, if you went in that restaurant and you looked at the menu and did not have calories on it, what would you choose, right? And then if you see the calories and that changes your mind, right? Like that is diet culture because you
Yeah.
just, right, that's disconnecting. You just changed your decision because you feel like you quote unquote shouldn't be able to have that amount of calories, right? And so things like that, being aware that, hey, if my mind has this like initial response of like, ooh, that's quote unquote bad, or ooh, that's, quote unquote too many calories, right? That's diet culture trying to disconnect you from your own internal sense to be able to like eat what you need, eat what you want, eat what sounds good, and feel confident that like you have the ability to regulate, right?
Yeah.
That sort of thing.
Yeah, no, that's so good. I didn't even think about that. The calories on the menus everywhere. Like that's
Yeah.
it's everywhere. It's everywhere.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to before we finished up, you touched on intuitive eating a little bit, which
Yeah.
I love, and I've loved like reading and understanding it. Do you find it's difficult to get people there to understand because we have such a negative view of food, like,
Uh, uh,
and I'm more and listening to it, and I pick up on it now more after having these interviews and talking. And I'm like, oh man, like even I've used those phrases, like, well, I'm probably gonna have to go for a longer walk tonight after that, like,
sure.
and just you're kind of joking, but you're not because you're like, well, I added a piece of cake, so now I'm gonna go for a little bit longer walk, and it's just so ingrained.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, just if you could speak into intuitive eating, if people don't really quite understand, and maybe they'd be interested into exploring that more.
Yeah. Oh, I love this question. So intuitive eating was originally like coined in the 1980s by two dietitians. So it has, there's a book, right? It's in its fourth edition, and intuitive eating has 10 principles. So some of the principles are things like make peace with food, challenge the food police, reject the diet mentality, things like that.
Hmm.
And so it's basically at its core is eating for self-care. And they talk about there's kind of like three pillars, right? Like rational thought, emotion, instinct, right? And none of those things are more important than the other when we make decisions about food. So rational thought might be like, oh, I am about to go to practice, so I'm gonna have something that's focused more on carbohydrates, right? Because those digest easier and they give me energy more quickly, right? Instinct might be like, oh, I don't know why, like I don't feel physically hungry, but I feel like I need something. So I'm gonna go get a snack, right? Emotion might be, it's my birthday, so we're having cake, right?
Hmm.
Like celebrations, things like that. And what intuitive eating says is none of those things is more important. It's a dynamic interplay, is what it says, between all three of those things, right? We can use rational thought, instinct, emotion to make decisions about food. And we don't have to use rules, right? We don't have to use a side of diet culture to make rules or to make decisions about food.
Right.
And so sometimes that gets viewed, right, or taken over by diet culture as, oh, well, intuitive eating just means eating whatever you want, whenever you want. And people can feel like, well, I just would eat cake all the time or whatever, right?
Hmm.
And what actually happens, right, when we return to that like innate intuitive eater that we're all born with, right? We're all born intuitive eaters, then we get to make decisions about food and we get to take back that ownership of I can choose if I want to have this food or that food, but there's no judgment, right?
Hmm.
I can be in charge of that based on, again, rational thought, instinct, emotion. The other thing, I'll say one more thing about it is sometimes the question comes up like, can athletes be intuitive eaters? Because sometimes people feel like, well, hunger gets suppressed after I exercise, and that's true. That can be true.
Hmm.
Or what if I don't feel hungry, but I need to eat, right? And those things are all part of intuitive eating. Intuitive eating is so nuanced. So it's not just eat when you're hungry, stop when you're full, right?
Yeah.
It's not just, there's no, just we're eating cake all the time. That's not what intuitive eating is. It can be if someone wants to eat cake all the time, right? Again, there's not judgment on that.
Yeah.
Um, and what happens oftentimes for people is like if there's truly no rules around food, usually people don't want to eat cake all the time, right? Might not make them feel super great. They might want something more crunchy. They might want something more fresh, right? Whatever, right? And so it's truly giving yourself unconditional permission to eat is another phrase they use,
Hmm.
without judgment, without rules, without compensation,
Yeah.
that sort of thing.
Yeah, and it's true because right, as soon as you're like, "Hey, I'm not gonna have any carbs," like, what's the one thing you start wanting more than anything else? It's carbs.
Yes,
So it's like
yes,
I can
yes,
totally
yes.
see why that would not work in anybody's favor. No, I know, and I know there's so much more to that, but I love that you touched on that because it can be very nuanced, but I think like such a better way of approaching food in a way that's like everything about us is designed to eat. Like we're meant
Mhm.
for this. And I think, as soon as we start suppressing that and making it the enemy, that's where like so much of this is just wild to me as I'm learning and just realizing how dangerous it can be, but also very conquerable. Like we can go back to what we were supposed to be and how we were supposed to eat amongst all of the mixed messages. So that's why this is so important. And I'm so thankful that you're having these conversations. So as we finish up with you, and let's say there's somebody listening and, maybe they're just worried, maybe it's just kind of on the horizon, or they're in it. They know that a loved one or themselves is definitely qualifying for an eating disorder. And I'm from New York where I feel like there's not a lot of help. Like, and I've worked with people, it's like that's why we're kind of going across the country to find and connect with people like you. Like what's a mom to do, or what's a coach to do? What's that next step of I know there's a problem. I don't know what to do about it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'll share a couple resources.
Okay.
There's a dietitian named Christy Harrison who's wonderful and has like a resource list on her website
Okay.
of providers all over the country that are eating disorder informed. So dietitians, therapists. I think one of the really important parts about treating an eating disorder, getting support for an eating disorder is that like interdisciplinary team. So working with a team, right? A therapist, a dietitian, oftentimes a medical provider, just depending on kind of what's going on. So there's a list of providers on her website.
Okay.
There's also a really wonderful book called How to Nourish Your Child Through an Eating Disorder by Wendy Sterling and Casey Crosby. A
Okay.
really, really wonderful book to have like language for how to talk, how to help, maybe things to avoid saying, how to
Mm,
provide encouragement. Sometimes things can get tense, right? If the eating disorder gets upset. And so how to just like navigate when you're trying to support your child and maybe the eating disorder is being really loud, right?
hmm
Um, I think other things that I'm thinking about are like more educational type things. So learning about eating disorders, learning about REDS, which is relative energy deficiency in sport. There's a book by Rebecca McConville about REDS. It's a really easy read, very short book and very like user friendly that talks about some of the signs and symptoms that someone might notice. Um, in terms of support, yeah, kind of getting them connected with a dietitian, a therapist that are eating disorder informed, I think is really big.
Yeah.
So having kind of your resources, whether it's Christy Harrison's website, whether it's, a doctor that you can go to and say, hey, who do I go to here? Um, various things like that. If there's a need for higher levels of care, those outpatient providers would be able to kind of direct people to a place that might be close to them or recommended. Like I said, I work at the Athlete Edge program in Denver, Colorado. Um, someone's welcome to reach out to me too, and I'm happy to point them in a direction to get support. I see a few people outpatient, so I'll have a private practice called Fueled Performance Nutrition. So that I'm happy to help support people in getting support that they need to. So they're welcome to reach out to me.
Oh, I love that. And I think it is important to go to the people who know. Just as we've had conversations, sometimes I think they go to the primary caregiver, and even though they are awesome and they probably love your child, they're not as informed. That's not their specialty. And as we've discussed and learned, these eating disorders, it's like a moving target with every different human being. It's like, oh, that's how yours started. Oh, that's what yours looks like. And it's almost like it's not like a broken arm. Like, hey, we can look at that and be like, yes, you have a broken arm. So
Right.
just understanding that that's going to be part of the frustration for anybody who's dealing with a loved one is it's not easy to peg down, and it can be a moving target and the results can be very different. So going to those of you like yourself who are experienced and understand the layers and can kind of help peel back like all of the things that need to be peeled back in this whole space. So I'm very thankful. I'm going to put links to you and to the references you just made in the show notes. Any final thoughts of encouragement, just in this space for female athletes, coaches, moms, anyone listening?
Yeah, well, I just really appreciate you creating the space for these types of conversations. And yeah, I think my last thoughts would be kind of like that adequate nutrition. Like if that's one thing that people take away, like I want people to get enough. I'm a sports dietitian. I want people to have fun and, like perform well if that's their goal. And at the end of the day, if they take one thing away, I want them to feel comfortable and confident eating enough without a side of diet culture.
Absolutely. Eat enough. I love it. That's a great
Yeah.
place to end. Thank you so much, Linda.
Thank you.